Hey everyone, welcome to our lecture for Key Concepts 5.2, Causes of the Civil War. I'll give you a second to read the key concept given by the College Board, so feel free to pause this video and go ahead and read it if you'd like. And also, if you would like access to this Google presentation that is on this video, feel free to click the link below and you can make a copy of that Google presentation and you can make your own annotations or notes to it. So like I said, I'll give you a second to pause it, read it, but then we'll continue. So let's go ahead and get started. Here's the graphic organizer that's going to run our discussion today. But basically what we want to focus on is what causes the Civil War. Okay, so if you look at this graphic organizer, hopefully you find it to be somewhat clarifying. But basically we're going to see increased levels of sectionalism, meaning North and South are going to have differences of opinions on various issues. We're going to see territorial expansion. Those things are going to lead to basically the debate over the expansion of slavery, which is then going to lead to failed compromises, increased levels of tension, regionalization. You're going to see the birth of the Republican Party, the election of Abraham Lincoln, and that will eventually lead us to secession and civil war. Okay, so we're going to focus on all these things today, and hopefully by the end of our lecture here, this graphic organizer here will make really a ton of sense and help us really visualize why the Civil War happened. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we have to recognize is there are vast economic differences between the North and the South, and the West for that matter. Okay, in the North, you have a pretty diverse economy. I think something we sometimes fall into the trap of is assuming the North is all industry and mechanization and stuff like that. And while that's true, while there is industrialization taking place in the North, it's also important to note that most Northerners are farmers still. So we do still see large scale commercial farming taking place in the North. So while in the South you have King Cotton, in the North you have King Corn. So farming is still very much a important part of the North's economy, but it's also important to note the North does have more industry. The North does have more merchants in the North than in the South, whereas the South obviously is still taking advantage of the cash crops, mainly cotton. Okay, and while some people say, well, they're still stuck in the past, remember that in the South, they're making tons and tons of money. I mean, cotton is the worldwide commodity that is most sought after. So if you think of like oil today as being that commodity that is traded worldwide, and the people that have that commodity are very wealthy, that was like cotton back then. Okay, so the North and South are very different. It's important to note that they are still connected economically, though. Southern cotton does go north to the textile industry in the north, so they are somewhat connected, but they're also vastly different. Okay, so that's important for us to recognize. So they're very different. They're going to have different interests. Okay. Also, what we're going to see happening, we're going to see higher levels of tension between North and South as a result of the abolitionist movement. Okay, and while most Northerners are not abolitionists, abolitionists were very much in the minority at this point. They're a very loud minority. Okay, they make a lot of noise, and they create tension between North and they create tension between the South. Okay, between North and South, I should say. And so when you think of abolitionists during this time, you're going to think of people like Harriet Tubman, who is very well known for her participation in the Underground Railroad, which if you look at the map on the right, you can see the routes of the Underground Railroad where Northerners would go down to the South and they would leave slaves to freedom, whether that be in the northern states or, which often happened, Canada. Okay, we also have Harriet Beecher Stowe, who is a very well-known abolitionist, and she wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which very much swells the ranks of the abolitionists. It talks about the brutality of the life of a slave and the breaking up of families. And it becomes a bestseller in America, and it also becomes an international bestseller. And many people actually give it credit for keeping the British and the French out of the Civil War because so many of the people in Europe were influenced by Uncle Tom's Cabin. So it very much is a successful book because it irritates the South and it brings a lot of people into the abolitionist camp. So this abolitionist campaign that we see taking place, well, like I said, kind of just summing up here, while most people in the North aren't abolitionists, most people in the North are still very much racist people who are against the expansion of slavery. They're not necessarily against slavery where it exists. They're against it expanding, whereas the abolitionists obviously want slavery to go away. They're the minority, but they're a loud minority. And they're a minority in the North that creates tension between North and South. Okay? Because of this loud argument put forth by abolitionists, we see the South, Southerners feel like they have to defend their way of life. And so we see a very aggressive pro-slavery argument that is put forth during this period of time. And it very much is in a response, to this abolitionist movement in the North. And Southerners tried to portray slavery as being something that is very natural. Okay? They make arguments like, Africans are inferior to whites. So, as a result, their natural state is one of slavery. Okay? Southerners talk about how slavery is natural because it's existed everywhere. If you go back into history, it's in every single society. Everyone has used slavery. So therefore, why should the South be demonized for something that has gone on for decades, okay, or even centuries? In addition to that, they often would point to religion. If you read the Bible, there are verses in the Bible, in the Old Testament specifically, that talks about slavery and how slaves should be obedient to their masters. And many Southerners use this as, kind of ammunition for their defense of slavery. And also, Southerners looked at their Northern counterparts. They looked at the industrialization process taking place, and they considered the whites that were working in the factories to be wage slaves. And they saw the lives that those people were living in the cities to be wretched. And they say, hey, your people are quote-unquote free, but they aren't treated very nicely up there. Whereas while our slaves don't have political freedom or any kind of freedom at all, really, they're happy. And they're fed and they're housed and they're treated much better than the people in the North. So we do see this tension, like I said, building between the abolitionists in the North and the Southerners trying to defend their institution of slavery in the South. And once again, that's just going to create levels of tension. And whenever tension runs high, obviously conflict is, sometimes not far behind. Okay? So anyways, let's focus on some of these failed compromises. Okay? So the first compromise I want us to look at is the Compromise of 1850. Now, this is a compromise that is built out of necessity because of the expansion of America. Okay? So in the last lecture, we talked about the Mexican-American War very briefly. But one of the byproducts of that war, obviously, was Mexican cession, the territory that was given in the Treaty of Hidalgo-Guadalupe, known in Mexico as the dismemberment. So we have all this new territory here, split up into California, Utah, and New Mexico territory. So basically what has to be done is this whole issue of, where does slavery go? Is slavery allowed in these new territories? What is going to be the deal here? So the Compromise of 1850 is brought about by our boy Henry Clay, who, he's the great compromiser. But basically he comes up with a plan that both sides are going to be relatively happy with. California is going to come into the Union as a free state. Okay? Now that is going to upset the balance of free states and slave states. Up until this point, there's been a balance of free states and slave states. Okay? So California coming into the country as a free state is going to give the North the advantage in the Senate. There's going to be more free states than slave states. Okay? The slave trade, would be banned in Washington, D.C. Many people thought it was incredibly hypocritical to have the slave trade taking place in D.C. Many countries across the ocean kind of raised their eyebrows when they looked at just how hypocritical that was. And so the Northerners got what they wanted. The slave trade is now banned in D.C. The Southerners got what they wanted, though. The Southerners also got some things here. The Southerners got a stricter fugitive slave law. They were obsessed with runaway slaves. And so this strict fugitive slave law would basically require the northern states to return runaway slaves to the South. So it was much more strict. In addition to that, Mexican Cession Territory, Utah Territory, and New Mexico Territory, that territory would be decided on by the people if there was going to be slavery in those territories. Okay, and then finally, the Texas debt that was incurred by that state when it was fighting the Mexicans for their independence would also be adopted by the federal government. Okay, so here is the Compromise of 1850. Okay, they're going to rely on a little bit of popular sovereignty for the new territory. There's going to be some give there's going to be some give here for both sides. Slave trade is now banned in D.C. However, the South gets their stricter fugitive slave law. Okay, so that's the Compromise of 1850. Now, the impact of the Compromise of 1850, unfortunately, is going to be one of increased tension, because the Northerners are going to be very much offended by the fugitive slave law. They're going to see it as being very inhumane. They're going to be seeing it as a major overreach of the slaveocracy. They're going to see it as, the slaveholding states are now telling the northern states what they have to do. It's a huge expansion of federal government power over the state power. And it's really going to have the opposite effect that the Southerners wanted. It's going to actually swell the ranks of abolitionists. People are going to now see runaway slaves be enchained and dragged back to their life of slavery. And many people are going to be appalled by that. So once again, while many Northerners aren't really abolitionists this time, they're not fans of the Southern states, and they're not fans of slavery. And now that slavery is being kind of forced on them, that they have to be implicit with this by returning these slaves, a lot of people are going to be offended by that notion, and we're going to see, once again, because of this fugitive slave law, it's going to create a lot of tension between the North and the South, now that the Northern states have to basically participate in slavery, whereas before they didn't. So anyways, let's move on. Here we can see a great map that shows us not only the expansion of slavery, okay, from 1820 to 1860, but we're also going to see the Underground Railroad routes where African Americans were able to escape slavery with the aid of Northern abolitionists. Okay, so anyways, soon after the Compromise of 1850, it's going to be necessary for another compromise, and that's going to be the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay, and the whole reason for the Kansas-Nebraska Act is because there is a growing need for a transcontinental railroad that's going to connect the East to the West. Okay, and Stephen Douglas, a very powerful Illinois politician, is going to want that transcontinental railroad to go through the North, specifically Chicago, is where he's going to want the terminus to go through. Now, in order to build the railroad through the old Louisiana Purchase territory, it would help if that territory was organized into a territorial government, whereas now, at this time, it was unorganized. There was no government whatsoever in these territories. So, as a result, there's going to be need for compromise. Okay, if the Southerners are going to allow this to take place, they're going to want to, essentially want something in return. Okay, so what basically Douglas proposes is he's going to propose the whole idea of popular sovereignty. That why not let the people decide if they want slavery in these territories or not. Okay, so basically, what he's able to do is he's able to pass this law in Congress, and it passes, and basically the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to state that popular sovereignty now rules. It's going to repeal the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise basically banned slavery in this territory, so it's going to repeal that, and it's going to institute now some popular sovereignty. Okay, so this is going to create some issues, obviously. This is going to lead to the whole idea or the whole event of Bleeding Kansas, where you're now going to have kind of the crazy show taking place here, because now you're going to have both types of people. You're going to have the whole people who are all about free labor. They're going to be rushing into this territory because they're going to want to have farms, their own kind of farms, and you're going to have slave owners trying to take their slaves into this territory to create new plantation-based farms. And so you're going to have this tension between free soil or free labor people and slave people. And that's going to actually create a very minor civil war that takes place in Kansas, and that's known as Bleeding Kansas. And this is going to further divide America. Okay, we're also going to see during this time, because of the whole controversies over some of these compromises, we're going to start to see the death of national parties and the growth of regional parties. So if you look at these elections here, these are all the presidential elections from the Mexican-American War up into the Civil War. You should notice that there are national parties. So for instance, in 1848, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party have support both in the North and also in the South. In 1852, it's a landslide election for the Democrats, but still, you see the Whigs do have some Southern support and also some Northern support. It's important to note that the 1852 election is also known as the death of the Whig Party. They are destroyed by the Compromise of 1850. In 1856, though, here you start to see some sectionalism developing a little bit. Okay, we have the new Republican Party popping up here in 1856, and they're going to be a party that pretty much runs on stopping the expansion of slavery. And so while their support is entirely in the North, it's important to note that the Democrats still are getting support in those free states. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Indiana, Illinois. Those are all states that are quote-unquote free states. They're not slave states. California as well in the West. Okay. However, by 1860, we see the death of national parties. By 1860, it's very clear that these parties, or the country, is now divided regionally. In the North, or in the free states, I should say, you have the Republicans, and then in the South, you have the Southern Democrats. Okay, so the national parties have been destroyed, and that's going to be a major cause for the Civil War. Okay, and one of the things to happen that really kind of splinters the parties is the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision is a decision that rips apart America. Dred Scott was a slave. His master took him into Northern Territory where slavery was banned. So he basically sued, saying, once I was taken to that territory, I'm freed. Supreme Court rules on this, but the Supreme Court basically says that you can't sue Dred Scott because you're property, you're not a citizen. So therefore you have no grounds to sue. Supreme Court goes further, though. Not only do they say that Dred Scott does not have a right to sue, what the Supreme Court does essentially say is that Dred Scott is property. And property is something that is protected under the Constitution. So as a result, states or the federal government, you can't tell people where they can or cannot take their property. So essentially what the Dred Scott decision says is it says slavery can go anywhere. Okay? People can take their slaves to any state, and no one can stop them. There are no laws to say that you can't take slaves anywhere. So it basically says the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, and it makes the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act kind of null and void because people can take their slaves wherever they want. Okay, so it is a monumental decision. Unfortunately, though, the North basically cries out and says that, this is nothing but the slaveocracy. The Supreme Court is now a partisan group, and they're going to basically discredit the Supreme Court as a result of that. Okay, but now that this Dred Scott ruling has taken place, the big impact of the Dred Scott case is it's going to splinter the Democrats. The Northern Democrats are going to be very irritated by the Dred Scott case. They're very much against the expansion of slavery into those northern states. The Southern Democrats are not going to trust the Northern Democrats any longer. And so they are splintered as a result of this case. And if you look at the results of the election of 1860, you can see that the Democrats run three candidates. There is a Northern candidate, Stephen Douglas. There is a Southern candidate, Breckinridge. And there's even middle states, the Constitutional Union Party, which is a Democrat as well, they run Bell out there. So if you look at the Democratic votes, they get 60% of the popular vote. So they overwhelmingly would have won had they ran a united campaign. However, because they splintered their party, they basically let the Republicans kind of walk into it here with an easy win. And so Abraham Lincoln wins the election. Now, this is incredibly important because Abraham Lincoln is running on the platform that is very offensive to these Southerners. He's going to run on the no expansion of slavery. He's going to run on a high tariff. He's going to run on a transcontinental railroad that runs to the north, not the south. He's going to run on the whole idea of using tariff money to improve on infrastructure, mainly in the north. And he's also going to run on free farms for free labor. So he's going to push the whole free soil, free labor ideology, which says that America, all the land that we have, should be for free labor. Farmers running their own farms, not having slaves. And so that's going to be very much something that the Southerners don't agree upon. Okay? So this is going to be kind of the last straw. Lincoln is someone that is seen as a threat to the Southerners. So as a result of his election, excuse me one second there, we're going to see secession taking place. Okay? South Carolina is going to start this off. They're going to secede. And secession basically takes place in two phases. Number one, you're going to have the Deep South. They're going to secede first. Okay, so if you look on the map in the top left there, those blue states, those states secede before Fort Sumter and before Lincoln is president. It's important to note. So Buchanan is still president when they secede. Now, Fort Sumter is a fort in South Carolina, okay, right by Charleston. Okay, so it's an important fort. The South Carolinians are not going to accept a federal fort in their territory, on their most important city. And so they're going to demand that that Union fort, that federal fort, be abandoned. And essentially, Lincoln refuses to do that. Okay? And eventually supplies run out of the fort. And Lincoln decides to resupply the fort, not with more men or more munitions, but he decides to supply it with, medicine and food. That's his plan, and he kind of knows what he's doing here. He knows that by doing this, he's probably going to provoke something. South Carolina, their militias fire on the fort. I don't think anyone dies in this process, but Fort Sumter is shelled, and basically the Union is forced to take their people off that fort. So now violence has ensued. Lincoln calls up the militia. He calls for 75,000 troops, and when he does that, the next round of states secede as well. And so that's when you have Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. They secede and they join the Confederacy. It's important to note that not all the slave states go with the Confederacy. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Those states stay with the Union through somewhat shady means, but nonetheless they stay. Okay? Maryland's obviously important because Maryland is surrounding Washington, D.C., so Maryland has to stay, or that puts the capital in a very precarious situation. Delaware is not significant because, hey, it's Delaware. But Kentucky and Missouri are critical. If Kentucky and Missouri had gone to the Confederacy and joined that fight, that would have given the Confederacy, a much better chance of winning the war. So keeping those two states for the Union was incredibly important. Okay? So anyways, that'll be our lecture for today. Feel free to email me or tweet me any questions. I hope this helps.